Okay, I think we can slowly start our event today. So, hello everyone. My name is Martha, and I'm part of Seoul Startups, Korea's biggest international startup community. We are gathered here today to have an amazing panel discussion with some really extraordinary people about how to survive as a startup, as a tech company in this COVID-19 era. Um, what is Seoul Startups, you may ask, if you haven't been our member before? We are a community of fun-loving professionals who are either working connected to the Korean startup scene or want to be connected to the startup scene. And we help create value by connecting people, institutions, and creating amazing events and experiences for anyone who wants to be part of the global startup scene here in Korea. We have over 1,200 members and we're growing day by day. We've had some really cool events, offline events last year, but now because of COVID, we've moved online and we are also having a great time. We are powered by a team of really talented and amazing professionals here on the Korean startup scene who are putting all their passion and effort to make sure that the best experiences come to you. So if you're not a member, please do go to soulstartups.com and join our online Slack community. But forget about me, forget about Seoul Startups. We're here today to celebrate some very great people. Here are our amazing panelists: Norbert representing Tokyo FinTech, Klaus representing German Accelerator, and Jordan representing number 2. I think it's number 2 or 2 squared. We will start with each of them introducing themselves. So I would like to ask Norbert to tell us about yourself and your amazing organization.
Thank you, Martha. So my name is Norbert. I'm German, but I spent the last 25 years outside, essentially split between New York and Tokyo. I spent more of my career in capital markets. I worked for Goldman Sachs and Barclays and as a consultant, and primarily have built and delivered front to back trading infrastructures and built a number of greenfield broker-dealers in Beijing, in China, in Brazil, built a bank in Korea, actually. That was 2006, I think, one of the more fun projects. So we split time. We came back to Japan in 2017, which is when I created Tokyo FinTech. And the idea behind this is very basic. When you drive innovation and transformation in a big financial services organization, many of the obstacles you face are actually human, and the most difficult thing to scale is the learning aspect. So if people don't understand what you're trying to do, then you're banging your head against the wall and you will invariably fail. And we've taken this now to the Tokyo or the national level, and what we want to contribute to with Tokyo FinTech is largely educating on the art of the possible in terms of new technologies and business models. We build a community and we'll feel very much associated with Seoul Startups in spirit, right? So we're coming out of the same origin from that perspective. Our community is now 3,200 members. And ultimately, all of this should move towards helping innovation in the financial services sector in Japan. We're registered as a not-for-profit, so this is also all on our personal time. We'd like to thank Deloitte for sponsoring us over the last 2 years and covering the operating cost, and other great partners. So that's it from me. Thank you, Martha.
Well, I forgot to add the most important thing is that Tokyo FinTech is an amazing partner of Seoul Startups, a community partner. So we're really, really delighted to be partnered with you and to have something cooking, starting with this podcast and hopefully more to come. Next to follow is another well, Norbert is from Germany, talking of which, a German accelerator, and Klaus, who has a really amazing presentation about his organization. So on to you, Klaus.
Unmuting helps. The first lesson of every webinar. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Marta, and happy to see some faces I know. Quick story about myself. I'm also German. Have been in Asia for about 27, 28 years now. I also lived in New York. I moved to New York when I was 15 years old, grew up in the States, came later back to Germany, and basically then I moved out to Asia with some steps in the middle. I'm a technologist by heart, right? So I used to develop satellite systems and sort of hardcore stuff, and worked with large corporates similar to Norbert. Decided to go on my own 20 years ago. So I started my first startup in 1999, which is still in existence today. And since then, I basically created 10 companies in different aspects of it, right? I mean, different technologies and so on. And I basically am part or run the German Accelerator in Southeast Asia, which is an organization I want to introduce briefly. Can you flip to the slides? Maybe slide number 4 or something. Yeah. So basically, we are lucky in a sense that our organization, we are also a non-profit foundation, actually in Germany. We get money from high net worth individuals, and we get money from the German government. And we are very lucky that we can spend that money on startups. When you go to the next slide, you can see we worked with quite a number of companies. We actually have 3 unicorns in that cohort by now. So we work globally, and that maybe goes to the next slide. So we started in Silicon Valley about 10 years ago, moved to New York to basically have a broader view on the United States ecosystem. We created our first vertical accelerator, which is in Boston with MIT, where we basically look at larger Series D, E, F life sciences companies coming out of Germany and who are going for American FDA approvals, etc. Then in 2017, we decided to create the German accelerator in Southeast Asia. You see our blip here in Singapore. And you see also a few other spots, one of them being Korea and Japan and India. So Korea very much is an interest market for us, and Japan as well. We have a lot of government, you can go to the next slide, yeah. We have a lot of government relationships, not because we're government, but we also know in Asia, government can be quite instrumental, regulators, you know, knowing the right people. So we try to work across all governments. For instance, in Japan, we have JETRO and so on. I mean, you all know that. In Korea, we're just starting. We're very happy also that we found you, Marta. And we have our next program coming, which is called Next Step, as the name indicates. Next Step is a market immersion program where we introduce new markets to German startups and SMEs. It's not only sort of limited to startups, but also SMEs. If you go to the next slide, please. You see, for us, South Korea is of interest, Japan is of interest. Why is that? Both markets have very comparable technology requirements than Germany. So obviously, one of our interests is to bring good German startups in robotics or so on out to Korea, to Japan. But likewise, we bring Asian startups to Germany. So we are not only a one-way street, we also bring Asian startups to Europe in the wider sense. So we run programs with Japan, we run programs with Singapore at the moment, where we bring around 20 to 30 startups per year into the German market for a market entry program, right? So we help them with local mentoring and getting their POCs and the usual thing what the accelerator does. So now in South Korea, when you go to the next slide, we basically just are starting. So we are very happy to find partners we can work with, and it's our interest basically to have a lasting relationship. So it is not just a one-time event that we come to Korea. So it's on our map, and that will hopefully bring us together in person soon. So thank you for having me on this webinar, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you, Marta.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Amazing, and it's amazing to have such a renowned accelerator tapping into the Korean market. And Seoul Startups is more than happy to welcome new cohorts of German startups that want to be part of our happy and delightful community, because our goal is to help entrepreneurs feel at home here as much as possible. One of those entrepreneurs is Jordan, representing the French, I think I'm going to butcher the name, number 2. Jordan, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to learn about what you guys are doing. It's actually quite amazing to see the communities and acceleration institutions that you're creating. It's really, really nice. So I am French indeed. Our company, actually, we call it NR2, but anything works as long as people are talking about it. I'm happy. So basically, I mean, yeah. So we started out in French. Actually, our company was thought through when we were living in China. So I was living in China in the past, and what we've done very quickly is that we created a search engine that allows anybody to find innovative startups from China. So if you go on nr2.io, you will see that it looks like Google, and you can type in whatever you want. If you type in AI, FinTech, for example, you'll see all of the companies that exist currently in China that are innovating in this area. What we've done is we've actually created a specific algorithm to rank these companies. So the way it's done is that you can think of that as the equivalent of what stock prices would be for public companies, but for private companies. So you have the companies ranked based off of what investors think in terms of how promising they could be. So that's what we do, and we started out with China, which is one of the biggest ecosystems in the world. And now we decided to expand to South Korea. I arrived here in Seoul in August of last year through a program called the K-Starter Grand Challenge. It's a global program where they invite companies from all over the world to try and attack the market. We went through that, and we decided to stay. So now I'm based here in Seoul. We're expanding our search engine to South Korea, and we hope soon to all of Asia. The reason why we're taking our time to do that is because in order to have the most reliable information on startups, which are quite difficult ecosystems to understand, we have to create algorithms in the local languages. So our algorithms are currently all in Chinese. This is why we have so much data on China, and we're now adapting them to Korean, so we can actually see everything that happens in Korea. And yeah, that's it. So thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to this.
Thank you, Jordan. And yeah, like it's awesome to have such a prominent startup tap into the Korean scene as well, and to have you on board with our community. So we will now continue to actually talking and discussing a very important question, or very important questions to do with what the startup scene here in Korea, in Asia is doing, what is happening in the post-COVID or current COVID Asian startup scene, and how we can overcome different difficulties that we have been experiencing. So without further ado, hold on a second. I would like to open the discussion with the question first to kind of both of you, or all of you, which is a bit of a personal question. That is, how is your company or organization currently dealing with the COVID-19 situation? Has anything influenced the way you operate? Are you operating differently, or is it business as usual? And if so, why? Have you been prepared before? So I would like to start with Jordan, because he's the startup representative here. So what is it like, first of all, being a startup in Korea during COVID-19, Jordan?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually very interesting. So before I answer, I'll just tell you how we work at NR2, because I think we're quite specific in a way. So because we're trying to be a bridge between Europe and Asia and try to link these ecosystems together, which is, I feel like, what a lot of people are doing here, which is awesome, and I really like that. It means that our team is actually working remotely a lot, even before COVID-19. So we have team members in the UK, we have some in France, in China, in South Korea. So we're actually used to working remotely. So that's just as an introduction. Now, in terms of the very specifics, the reality is, even though we're working remotely, we see that there is definitely an impact on the team, because especially those who are in Europe or were in China during the outbreak in China, because the fact that you are actually stuck at home, even though you can still work as usual for us, still it has an impact on you personally and how you engage with life, which I think is something that everybody's going through right now, especially people with kids. Now, specifically in South Korea, we didn't have a quarantine here, so that means that this emotional pressure is very different. We don't feel it the same way. I know that in March we had some kind of an outbreak where people were starting to get worried in South Korea, but even then, because we had masks, everybody were wearing masks outside, and everybody was very careful. You could still go outside, and even though you couldn't go to a club, you could just go and walk near a lake. So that means that I would say psychologically and emotionally, Korea is actually, it's very easy to go through that, because you can go outside and have an almost normal life. I have a lot to say, but I feel like it would be good to hear other experiences. But in summary, yeah, I think it changed a lot of things. And in South Korea, I think we're quite lucky, actually, because of the way it's handled here. And technology is a big part of it, by the way. Just before I pass on, I'd like to say that. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but in South Korea, we have maps like Google Maps. It's called Kakao Map or Naver Map. And on these maps, you can see where masks are available in pharmacies in real time, which means that technology is actually part of how you handle life here, and it makes it easier. So yeah, I think I feel like it was a bit easier in South Korea.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I can relate to that, because we're also based same city. But how is it literally across the sea in Japan? So what, Norbert, what does the situation look for Japan tech companies, and specifically the companies in your community, FinTech companies? Has anything changed when it comes to working in the business way of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Japan is probably an import destination for startups. So we're attracting more startups than we're exporting. And clearly the personal interaction has been shut down completely. So you still can't travel to Japan from most countries. And that has a good side and a bad side. So it's clear that anything we've done in the event space and helping companies physically on the ground to get connected here, that has come to a complete stop. On the other side, interactions have increased, I would say, at the digital level. And I think it's for all of us the same. And the intensity of the working day has increased, right? Because the natural breaks that you have by crisscrossing the city and going from one client to the other and spending half an hour in the taxi or in the subway has been eliminated, and you've got 12 hours back-to-back Zoom calls. So the accessibility is actually there. I'm absolutely amazed, and this is a typical Japanese thing in a way, where maybe for a long time nothing changes and then suddenly everything switches completely, that some of the traditional, what you would consider traditional Japanese financial services player like Sompo, which is one of the big three insurers, for example, they switched to working from home basically from one day to the next. And although the state of emergency has been lifted, they will continue working from home for a little while. And so that's quite amazing when you know the Japanese working culture and how much face time actually used to mean. And in a way, I don't want to be cynical, but the crisis has been maybe a bit too short. So I'm not entirely confident that this behavior will stick, and there's always a risk that people flip back to their old ways. But what we see as green shoots in terms of what is possible when you create flexibility, and I think it's truly about flexibility. It's not black and white. We don't want to work 100% in the office, we don't want to work 100% from home, but give people the flexibility to shape their life based on their individual needs and make that work in the greater community that is their team or the company, right? That would be a complete mind shift here in Japan, and we're seeing very good signs of that possibly happening.
Wow, well, thank you so much. In a way, similar to Korea, but different as well. And it's really interesting to see that countries so close have shared a bit of a different approach to dealing with the situation and being on top of things or not being on top of things. Klaus, you represent an organization that kind of spans around the world and has representation in all the countries, but gathers primarily German startups. So how have the companies in your cohorts and your portfolios have been dealing with what has been going on in the world, especially in different geographical regions?
I mean, for us, this has been a shock to the system. We are if you so want, a consulting company at the end of the day, and we are used to face-to-face engagements. We have co-working spaces and all these different places. We're used to have startups with us. We work with them. We work with founders and so on, hands-on. We have our mentor pool. They come to our places, right? So we are an organization which is very driven by physical place, actually, right? Or we were, I have to say, we were. So when the situation kicked in and suddenly we were faced with all this situation like everybody else, right? We basically relatively fast managed to put our workshops and everything we do, the whole programs online. The startups moved along, right? So we didn't lose startups at all, right? So they basically, some programs, they moved from physical engagement to next day online engagements, right? Others started online. We run lean canvas workshops and all things online, right? So a lot of it has worked for us. For our staff, I think, and maybe this is true for all of us, right? It has been very stressful. Some people, they live at home, they couldn't go out because of the lockdown rules, like in Singapore, our office is still closed. So it has been very difficult for our staff, right, to basically work on all these different dimensions. There's a lot more coordination when you deal with an online environment where you have to deal with individuals. You can't squeeze as much in an hour and all of these things, what we all learned in the past many weeks or months already, right? But all in all, I think our experience has been positive. Even working with partner organizations, we work also with a few large organizations, like, I mean, the German car industry and so on. So we didn't see massive drop. I mean, what we have seen is less interest in investments. That is something we have noticed everywhere. I think there is less interest in POCs, right, which is hard for startups. So we see this, but I wouldn't say it is related to a general loss of interest in innovation or in the startup world. It's really that, like every large organization, they also need to manage their own changes, and they need time to basically do what they need to do, just like we were required to change, right? I mean, we are relatively small, even if we're a global organization. So for us, it was a relatively fast move. And like maybe one more sentence, our experience was that the cadence is actually very high. So a lot of startups, when they said they participate, they come, right? We didn't have any issues with any of it, but I think this is also somewhat related because companies didn't have other choices. If I'm confined at home, I have the whole day to go online and maybe participate in virtual acceleration or whatever I do. I wonder how this world will look like when suddenly economies like in Korea are open again, people go back to the office, you have sales calls again, and basically online is competing with the offline world, how it will look like. So for us, the future is, I think we will go back to the physical world, not completely. I think we will keep some online content and so on, but we will definitely go back to a physical engagement. Yeah.
Well, if I can answer about the Korean scene, is that yes, we may be back to physical world, or we were always in the physical world, but because the rest of the world isn't, that is kind of forcing us to also adapt to new virtual tools. And that tapping into that, I kind of would like to go back to you, Klaus, and ask you specifically about the startups in the region. I guess Southeast Asia is mostly the region that you're mostly expertised in. How has the initial shock of the COVID lockdown affected the startups, especially early stage startups in your region?
Well, what we have seen, and obviously we work with the founders, as I said, right? We have seen that the first thing is we told them to basically tighten the ship, right? I mean, you need to preserve cash, right? You need to be very careful how you maneuver, right? You want to be true and honest to your team, right? I mean, you have to give them a future perspective, but at the same time, you need to be honest that it's tough and maybe we need to cut salaries in order to keep everyone going. So what we did is we basically went into crisis mode with all of our startups. We have retired CFOs who we would put on task basically to work with startups. We had a few startups, they were in the middle of funding rounds. They still managed to get the money, right? So in our case, I mean, it seemed like they were quite successful and lucky. We encouraged the startups to think of their clients, right? I mean, what baffled me the most as an individual, right? Like all of us, all of you, I'm a subscriber to many different services, from airlines to hotels to whatnot, right? To internet and anything. But basically, I hardly heard from any of my service providers about, dear German accelerator, dear Mr. Carter, you know, we are here for you. Can we help you, right? I heard nothing, right? I'm a customer to so many organizations and I heard nothing. So what we did is we encouraged all of our startups to go out, talk to their specific clients, ask them what they need, try to understand, you know, the cheese has moved for your client. So how do you need to move around that you can sort of make sense out of that situation and not get lost in it, right? So we are very high touch organization when we work with startups, and basically that's what we did. The cheese has moved for everyone, but having said that, our intake, we just took another batch on, has grown, right? So there doesn't seem to be like a thought, oh my God, you know, the future, there's no future, right? So I think everybody thinks there is a future. Let's roll up the sleeves and let's go, right? I mean, this is generally speaking what we see, right? We just onboarded 26 startups across our locations. Everything is good what we can see there.
Wow, that's some really thoughtful and food for thought. Tapping into you, Norbert, how is it going on, not only in Tokyo and Japan, but in FinTech market in general? Because I've actually read that you guys are doing pretty well, all things considered. Is it true, or was it just a clickbait title that I came across?
No, I think there's certainly aspects of that. And if you look at the US and Europe, for example, when it goes about dispersing the subsidy, the support money during the crisis, right, in the US, Stripe and PayPal were engaged in distributing the funds. There were certainly startups in the UK that have done a pivot and adjusted their business in a very short time frame, which they can because they're entirely digital compared to the legacy banks, to help the government distribute funds there as well. And don't know what the situation is in Germany. In Japan, unfortunately, this has gone the traditional way, and little known fact, I think, that Entity Data was engaged to build a website to distribute this 100,000 yen, about the $1,000 that every resident here gets, and the website was a disaster, which is not surprising, but it's a bit of a wasted opportunity to give this work to a pure digital startup that knows what they're doing, help them grow through the crisis and play a role in solving the crisis. So unfortunately, we're back to kind of the bad behaviors. I think going back to the macro view, right, people clearly have been hesitant to use cash. So in many countries, there's been move to cashless payments much more, and even contactless payments. There were articles that the ATM network in the UK is rather stressed because hardly anybody wants to go to the ATM, push the buttons and get money out. So the level of activity actually reduced so much that they can't cover their operating cost anymore. And so generally you see, I think, a much more shift to digital financial services where it hasn't happened so far. Clearly, European Nordic countries, Sweden is like 95% cashless. There's not much more that you can do, but in every other market, this will certainly be a catalyst towards moving that way. And that also includes Japan, right? We're still very traditional, especially in the services sector. We have personal and corporate seals, a hanko, so you stamp documents. And if you're trying to work from home, but you actually need to send somebody into the office to physically stamp paper to keep the business going, I think the realization has set in that there are better ways in 2020 to deal with this, and the legal framework is actually there for it. So companies like DocuSign have been in Japan for 10 years, for example. There's some debate as to if you get into a legal conflict, what type of evidence does the court actually accept, and would they rightfully rely on purely digital signature? But otherwise, again, I think good catalysts never let a good crisis get unused. So take advantage of this and now drive digitization forward. And then there's a huge opportunity for all FinTech startups that survive this drought, which no doubt we will have, right? There's POC timelines with incumbent institution take a long time. And so you add 6 or 9 months through that with the crisis. So you need to hunker down, work on your product, think whether there's a certain angle where you can help the crisis. But otherwise, I would just repeat everything that Klaus said in terms of tightening the belts and seeing this through. I think once you come through these dark times, there's actually a very bright future at the other end.
Right. So with every crisis, there comes an opportunity, but it also requires discipline and responsibility from the startups. Jordan, what about Korea? Because everybody's been singing praises about how Korea handled the actual health hazard of the COVID-19. But what about the startups? How, from your perspective, how have they been fending with what's been going on, and how have the institutions here in Korea been helping them along the way?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer, I'd like to just come back to one point that was mentioned by Klaus, and I wish you'd be subscribers to our service, because we've reached out to everybody who subscribed, and actually it's very interesting because so as I said, we're a search engine which is mostly specialized in finding South Korean and Chinese companies, and as it happened, China went through the crisis before everybody else, and they've taken other measures, and so. Actually, what we've done when this happened, we upgraded our algorithm so that they could find all of the products that were used in China and proven useful to fight the virus. And then we have communicated that to a lot of people. And we found actually that a lot of people were very active in trying to researching these products. And actually, it's one of the most searched terms on our search engine right now, which also gives you ways to contact all these people who are working on these things in China. And then something that we've also done, so I actually write a weekly newsletter where I talk about everything that happens in China in terms of innovation. And in this newsletter, I have been trying to explain and show through data what was actually happening and what it meant for startups and other companies. And that relates to your question, Marta, where I think that what's very interesting with the crisis that we see is, I think it's very different from a financial crisis, in as much as in the past, when you thought about a financial crisis, then the entire world is just suffering. And even though everybody is suffering today, business-wise, what's happening is some companies are actually striving through this crisis because of the way they work and their business model. And if you look at actually the data, and it's very true in China with, for example, live stream sales companies, or all of these companies who had already digital business models, they actually are having increasing sales and very, very good numbers. FinTech, as said by Norbert, is a very good example where there's a lot of companies who are striving thanks to these crisis. So I think what we're seeing is a change of paradigm. It's like a paradigm shift where something was already happening in the world and it was going at a certain pace. And because of this crisis, what's happening is this change is just a lot faster now, and we're forced into the change. Everybody using Zoom, everybody using that. It was something that, for example, us, we used all the time. And now what happens is everybody uses it. And so it's very interesting to think about this. And South Korea is a very good example of that. As I said, this map feature where you get access to live stock of masks in pharmacies on your phone is a very good example where technology is now being forced into your life, and actually you see how useful it is. I have countless examples of people I know in Europe, in France, or in the UK that were not used to using certain technologies, and now are learning to use them, forced to use them, and they start to see, well, actually, you know what, maybe I'm going to keep using it. I think at the very beginning of the discussion, I don't remember if it was Klaus or Norbert, but someone said, you know, we're not going to go back fully to normal after this crisis. We're probably going to keep doing some of those calls online. And that, I think, is very interesting, and it's very true in many different aspects. And I think this is something which is very interesting. And it's also very true in South Korea. I was on another webinar with the Case of Grand Challenge yesterday, and I can see how now webinars are becoming a thing, which means that, as it was said again at the beginning, this bridge we're all trying to create here between countries is a lot easier now because people are available to think about these other countries. We have seen on our search engine a lot more interest into China than before. Because when China was a country where, yeah, well, they're doing things, but it's not relevant to me. Now we're talking about China and we're saying, well, actually, they've been fighting the virus in a certain way, which is interesting. South Korea was not on the map. Like, nobody cared about South Korea before. I mean, at least it's what I've seen. Like, of course, everybody thinks about South Korea, but in terms of, like, for example, investors, they're not looking at South Korean startups, or not a lot. And through this crisis and the people seeing, well, actually, South Korea is doing well, what's happening, they're looking at a search engine, finding companies, they're like, well, actually, can you tell us more about what's happening in South Korea? And when I say we have, I don't know, 20,000 companies around doing incredible things, they're like, oh, really? So it's not just Hyundai and Samsung. There's actually a lot of other small companies. And I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of them, and they're doing incredible things. And you should definitely talk to them. And some of them have products in English, and sometimes you don't even know it's a Korean company. So I think that what we're seeing is that things are connecting, people are being more aware, and technology is being forced into our lives, which is I think quite interesting.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your answer, Jordan. And that makes me really happy that kind of all of you answered your questions in a positive note, because one of the biggest worries that I had was that we will be saying like, oh my God, this is like the end of the startup world and the technology and everything, and we're doomed. But apparently we are all optimists and we're full of hope for the future. Klaus, kind of talking about hope, as you know, one of the most important things for startups is getting funding. How has that changed? You kind of mentioned it briefly in your previous response, but how has this changed during the COVID-19? And how do you think will the investors now look at startups? Will they look at them differently? Will they evaluate them differently? Will they be looking for different things that they had before?
Yeah, excellent question. So a few observations. So yesterday I was talking to 500 startups in the US and also plug and play. And basically, so the attitude in our discussion was a little bit a wait and see. So startup is under stress. You know, if there's a deal as an investor, I'm just gonna sit and see, you know, what will happen to that startup. So if it's strong enough, it will be there still in a while, and then I put my money in. So it's a little bit like wait and see attitude. It's of course very stressful for the founders. But what I find amazing, this is the first time that I see that governments are creating dedicated vehicles to bail out or help startups. Bailout is the wrong word, sorry for that. Help startups. So like Singapore just came out with a $285 million fund available to any startup, one-on-one matching, right, to basically help them in the crisis if they can't find regular funding right now. Germany came out with similar measures. I don't know other countries, I'm sure there are many, but the point is, I think it's the first time in let's say my history, I'm aware that a government would actually try to support startup ecosystem, the innovation which comes out of it, even to the point that they fund the startups in an emergency mode, which we kind of need right now, right? So that means for me a few things. Number one, I think most governments have realized that the startup ecosystem is an innovation source which you cannot deny, and you shouldn't, let's say, stop, right? The smart thing is to keep it going, right? So I think that is one key, and the, let's say, it's a source of employment already, which is also different to 10 years ago. I mean, when we talk about last crisis, financial crisis, and so on, I think nowadays the startup ecosystem is a real source of employment in many countries. It's a source of innovation. It's definitely a view on the future. And governments have realized that, and that's why I'm optimistic that the funding will not be the problem, right? It will sort itself out. If you have a good idea, you solve a real problem, you have a good team, you'll get the money even now. That's my view.
That's, well, that brings a lot of hope to us in the future. But I have a question for Norbert. Norbert, in the current times, when it comes to tech communities like Tokyo FinTech, and in a sense also Seoul Startups, how has our role changed? Has it changed? And what can we do as a community to support the ecosystem better?
Before I get to that, allow me to comment on what Klaus said and maybe introduce a bit of controversy here. We're hugging each other and we're all in agreement. We'll need to create a bit of excitement, because I'm probably a bit more of a pure capitalist in that way, and I don't fancy at all what's going on in the world right now with bailouts or support schemes of many different flavors. And right, that starts in the US, where you push money into airlines that have been buying stock back for the last 6 years and right, have bad cash management and risk management policies, as has German Lufthansa, which just got 5 billion or so from the German government, right? To some extent, we have learned from the financial crisis 2008 that the government can print that money, and it's really created a safety net, and I think invalidated what capitalism is about. And we actually should let some of these companies go bankrupt, whether they're big ones or small ones, doesn't matter. And so also for startups, I don't think you can claim on the one side you want to be the next Bill Gates or Elon Musk and become a billionaire, and then the crisis hits, and let's face it, many of the founders that we have today, right, even if they're in the 25 to 30-year-old bucket, they haven't really experienced the big crisis yet. Klaus and I have some gray hair to show for the crises that we have been through, and that's like Russian currency crisis, Asian currency crisis, internet bubble bursting, 9/11, right, next financial crisis, euro crisis, etc. It's just another thing in that regard, and you've got a playbook how to deal with it. And I think part of entrepreneurship is letting companies fail. And so I agree with this sentiment that it's much more source of employment, and especially in countries, right, like Japan and Germany that are SME dominated, that is ultimately where the workforce resides. So you need to support some of it, but I'm not really warm and fuzzy about that. Sorry, just had to get this off my chest. You ask about our role. I think the importance of a connector between ecosystems, and we touched upon that, I think, in some comments before that, right, we played, I think, a very domestic role, let's say, although we have 20 international corporations with like Seoul Startups and others, where we exchange ideas, where we exchange startups when they come here, etc. But from a focus of where we see our audience, I think it was much more domestic focused, while I think this is my fourth event in the last 2 weeks where we do something across borders and really connect the ecosystems and the relationships that we build here, if we can leverage them towards our members, quote unquote, right? We don't have formal like company membership, but if somebody came and said like, I want to evaluate the Korean market, it's like I can point them to a few people. I think we can clearly help in that regard. I think we can help in our experience, what it means to work through a crisis, right? This, if you've done this 4 or 5 times in your life, then it feels a bit different than the first such shock. And I don't think that we're fully through this yet. And I don't necessarily mean a second wave, right, which might or might not come. I have no insights into that, but we shut down whole economies for 8 to 12 weeks. And we have many SMEs that might still make it through the next 2 or 3 months, but ultimately kind of will fall off and get bankrupt. And it's hard to foresee what additional shock that might bring to the financial system and the economy overall. I don't want to declare victory too early, both on fighting the pandemic as well as the economic recovery just yet. I think we'll have still see some hardship coming our way, that no doubt, right, we'll all navigate, but I'd rather wish it was the middle of 2021 already.
Yeah, well, we still have 6 months to go, unfortunately. To wrap up the discussion and before opening the floor to the questions from our attendees, I have one question that maybe is not necessarily to do with COVID. It so happens, and believe me, that was not intentional, that we have 3 Europeans living in 3 different Asian countries, which it's, well, actually, including myself, actually, that's 4 as well, although I am together with Jordan in Korea. And I would like to ask your perspectives on doing business in your particular regions and why you think these regions are great to be at as a startup, as a tech company, and what are the next trends that are going to happen in that specific region that we should be on the lookout for. So maybe first from Jordan, because I don't think he has gone first yet. So you go, Jordan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have lots of things that I'd like to also say on these funding questions, but I think I'll skip, and if there's a discussion, I'll be very happy to go on that. On the question that you're asking, in basically living in another country and doing things, I think it's difficult for me not to be biased, because this is why NR2 exists. The reason why we created this company, so it came out when I was actually living in China. I was director in an investment fund in Beijing, helping European tech companies enter the Chinese market. And what I realized at the time was that actually so many things happen in China that nobody else is aware of, that we need to find a way to connect things together, because even though we say we're in a globalized world, actually a lot of ecosystems are very, very local. And so I met my co-founder at the time, he was also in Beijing, and we basically had the same view from different angles, and we thought, you know what, let's just try and solve this problem. And we went about it through data and through creating a search engine. And I think that, you know, I write this newsletter every week where I see there's like, I think about 100 fundraising I share every week in China only. I'm not even talking about the other countries. And living in these different countries, you see how being on the ground in the local ecosystem, you understand things that you want to share with everybody. You want to help these companies thrive internationally. You want investors outside of these ecosystems know about them so that they can invest. And basically, you want to fluidify the ecosystem. So we're trying to do that. The reason why we're in South Korea is for this exact very reason. Is if you think of South Korea and you can play the game in Europe, you ask people, well, what do you know about the South Korean ecosystems? How many companies do they have? What kind of companies? If people give you companies which are not Samsung and Hyundai, you'll be very lucky. It's like, you know, there's even like Coupang, which is a huge company here. We use it, I mean, I use it a lot, probably too much, but basically a lot of people use it a lot. And the thing is, nobody knows about this company in Europe. I mean, very few people, the ones that are really experts and they're sophisticated about innovation, they might know, but they probably, a lot of people don't. And so these ecosystems are local, which means that you have to spend time in them to really understand them. But when you do, you can then share. And I think that's what we're all doing. And so for me, doing business in another country is all about learning, being very humble that I am in South Korea. And the reality is I've been here for 6 months. I don't understand anything. I'm just learning. I'm just interacting with other people. I go to, there's a street in Gangnam where there is entrepreneurs everywhere. I just like to go and work in cafes there just to randomly meet people and try to understand what they're doing, what's their story, what kind of companies they're creating. In our offices is the same. And I think it's all about learning, trying to understand how local ecosystems work so that then you can connect them globally. And I think that history has shown that, maybe you guys know the theory of Black Swan, which says that an innovative event is usually impossible to predict. Something's going to appear in the world, and there's no way you can predict that. You just have to adapt to it. Well, actually, if you look at the world right now, this is very true, and I buy in this theory a lot. But if you think about the world as one place, actually you can predict the diffusion of these black swan events in the world. There's so many examples of like a company like Ofo, which is a bike sharing company that appeared in China and was a real black swan. It was impossible to predict that, or people who did that, they were very, very good. And then actually there's another company in the US from Chinese expatriates that was created. It's called Lime, which we now have everywhere. And so if you cannot actually predict Ofo, you can probably predict Lime if you're aware of what's happening in the world. And so I think that that's the reason why we exist. We're trying to help people see that. And I think that living in these different ecosystems is the best way to realize that there's a lot you don't know and there's a lot you have to learn, and basically just do that and then share with more people.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan, for that insight. How about Klaus? Like, what is it like to be as a Westerner in the specific Asian region, and what is the next big trends that you will be observing in specifically Southeast Asia, but also other regions that your German accelerator is active in?
Yeah, I mean, for me as an individual, a little bit like your story, Marta. So I came to Asia in the 80s the first time, and I just explored this very different world, right? Different to America, different to Germany, and it just fascinated me. And that fascination has never left me until today, right? I see a lot of entrepreneurial spirit on the smallest to the biggest scale when I walk through the streets in Manila or in Jakarta, right, or in Bangkok or wherever, right? So and I think that is what kind of kept me here, right? So I find this is obviously, I mean, we are all living in the future region of the world, which will eventually dominate, right? I mean, Asia and the 21st century, that belongs together, right? So we are in the right place. And I think the startups who come out here, I mean, for us as an accelerator, obviously we want to help them to enter these markets. And I go very much with Jordan. You have to live in a place to understand it, right? I mean, I was living in the Philippines many years ago, and I did not understand what I was doing for a very long time, right? So it's not easy. I mean, what you see is not necessarily what you get, right? The subtle messages in these cultures, right? So they are complex, and to get them takes time, right? So you need to be there. That's what we try to tell our startups, right? This is also one reason why I don't believe that a virtual thing will work, right? I mean, we all have a role. The organizations have a role, like Tokyo FinTech and what you are doing, Marta, and I don't think that will go away, right? So to me, I think if anything, we will be needed more than ever, because when you look at the political landscape, which we maybe shouldn't talk about, but we have all this deglobalization and all these activities which are going on, driven partially by governments and so on. I don't believe in that, right? I think the world can only function if it comes closer together. And I believe startup ecosystems can be a catalyst to do this, right? To bring the world back together, regardless of what's going on in the big politics, right? So I'm happy, you know, that we are doing what we are doing, and I'm excited every day when I wake up, and I hope I can come to Korea soon and we shake hands and have a drink.
Oh, that would be amazing. A little reunion here in Seoul. You as well, Norbert. We're so close yet so far right now. But since you've been in Japan and in Asia for so long, like, how has it changed when it comes to the startup scene and the possibilities and the coming trends in not only Tokyo, not only FinTech, but in general in the innovation scene?
Well, that's a very multi-layered question or answer to that question, simply because there's so many differences between the manufacturing sectors, or let's say the hardware sectors and the services sectors. There are differences between how Japanese companies, right, which are very global enterprises, behave domestically versus how they behave internationally. And it comes back to, I think, for somebody who doesn't understand Asia or doesn't understand Japan, comes here for the first time, our role is to help navigate all of that complexity a bit. It's clear that if you sit in Europe or you sit in the US and you look at Asia, it's one blob. It's not one blob, it's multifaceted. China is different than Korea, is different than Japan, is different than ASEAN, and anybody in ASEAN would say Singapore is different from Malaysia is different from Indonesia, etc. And so there are these unique differences, and people who have been on the ground, echoing what my co-panelists said before, who've been on the ground and understand these nuances, are much more effective in navigating this. And I think that's very helping. I just think if you look at Japan, to come back to your question, the typical Japanese companies produces something, right? It's I had a podcast recently where a professor from university described it as a simple process. That means not necessarily the manufacturing process is simple, but you figure out something physically that you want to produce, you design it, and there's an output that you bring to market, which is very different from the world that we find ourselves in today, where so many things are purely digital. And I don't think, and not Japan specific, also many European countries haven't really made that switch yet. And the opportunity on the purely digital side, or the combination of physical and digital, is a unique opportunity, huge opportunity for the next few years. And the marginal cost of digital services is zero. And so it will fundamentally change the playing field. And if you look at some financial services, you look at payments, you look at stock trading, but we're going already to a zero price. And it's very difficult to compete in that field if you are dragged down by legacy assets.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Norbert. And yeah, it was a complex question with quite a complex answer, but you rocked it. I would like to, I have a lot of questions, but I would like to kind of start with the questions that our attendees have been asking. So I'll start with the ones submitted to the Q&A box. And the first one is, what new platform are you looking for now, other than the virtual or online platform? How has it changed your business model, and what strategy are you now looking to keep your startup afloat? What about for those who have had their business for decades? How has the current condition impacted your business? So I guess we kind of already answered that question, but for Jordan, is there any tools, online tools, or online platforms that you can recommend for our attendees, for our community, to check in and use to make their businesses more efficient during these times?
I mean, that's a difficult question, because I think that tools need to be at the service of whoever is using it, and so therefore they're going to be very different from very different people. The way we go about that as a startup is we have to be extremely efficient with our time. So that means that we will try and have just not a lot of tools. We just want to have as the smallest number that we can have, so that we know where the information is, and we go about that in a very efficient way. So that for us means that we have two sets of tools. One set is for very technical things. So I don't know to which extent it's going to be interesting for people, but like, let's say things like GitLab, or things that allow developers to work on the same things at a distance while keeping everything synchronized in a way which is very reliable. So that's something that we do, which is very important how we work. And then there is the operation tools that we use. For us, we're using Microsoft. So that means that they have versions of many things included in their subscription. So I know people use Slack, for example, which I also use, for example, for Seoul Startup, where I communicate with people, and I love it. As for our internal tools, because Microsoft has something called Teams, which is linked to the cloud service that we use, and also something called a Planner, which is a version of Trello that a lot of people use in the startup industry. For us, we like to keep it simple and just use everything that Microsoft provides, so that everything is linked together and it's very easy and we don't have to think about anything. And so we just make it as simple as we can. And then we're open to everything that people use. So for our own things, when we have calls, for example, we use also Teams, which handles video calls very well. But we also, of course, use Zoom whenever people want to use Zoom, because that's something that we do. So I think it's a question of finding your efficiency balance within your company, because especially for startup, and I'm talking as someone that works in a startup, is you really need to be efficient. So keep it as simple as you can, and then just be open to use whatever other people use, and be easy with technology so that you can adapt to whatever you need to adapt to talk to everybody. That's what I would say.
Oh, thank you. Well, how about our two other panelists? Are there any tools that you discovered over the last few months? I assume most of them would be online, but not necessarily, that have been a game changer for your business, but maybe also for your personal life.
Okay, I'll come first. Maybe Norbert can think a little longer. I first of all, I completely agree with Jordan. I think as a startup, and I consider our organization startup-like, you have to keep it simple. Sometimes, obviously, you have constraints, but on our end, I mean, we work with Google Docs for no specific reason, except they're all the same reasons than Jordan, right? So basically, you have the information in one place and all of it. I also think it's important. Sometimes your client forces you to use a certain environment, and then you have to be open to it. But to answer the question specifically, I think this COVID situation didn't really change the way how we use tools, right? We have used Zoom before, now we use it more. We use Slack, maybe now we use it more. We use our Google Doc environment or Google Drive environment. That I don't think has changed. So for us, it's the same. As a personal experience, I've been now confined at home this is week number 12. I definitely moved to online shopping. I think that is something I can confirm, like most other people, right? So anything you can imagine, from the fish, which you can't find anymore, right, to whatever, we online shop, right? So, I mean, that has changed, right? I think there is also personal change in behavior in that way. But as a company, I think tool-wise, it's the same than before.
I never thought I would do an online sake tasting, but it just goes to the creativity that some of these entrepreneurs have, right? When bars are closed and you can't come to the bar, then the bar can come to you. And so there's a sake brewery and the sake bar here in Tokyo that teamed up, and the first event was still rather small, with 13 people attending. And right, the delivery services in Japan are just awesome. So you basically get your selection of sake the day before. You get on a Zoom call and you have the brewer explain the sake, and everybody can try it at home. The second event had more than 40 people, and they might actually continue doing it because it was so successful. And right, the brewery is not in the middle of Tokyo, so they actually get access to customers directly, which they've never done before, unless you actually go and visit the brewery, and you generate like a multiple of the revenue that's possible. So I just think the ingenuity of saying we'll do this, we try this, right? What's the downside is fantastic. It doesn't matter what the tool is. It's like you just need to rely on human creativity.
So true, so true. And I kind of wish Korea had a bit more of a lockdown so we could actually experience that sort of services as well. I think we're a bit too spoiled by having easy access to bars, even in the Corona times. So, dear participants, if you have questions, please raise your hand. In the meantime, let me go back to the questions submitted here in the Q&A box. We have a question specifically for Jordan. You mentioned your startup has embraced remote work even before COVID-19. How do you build an innovative and inclusive company culture in a remote environment?
That's a big question, and it is a big question because I think that culture for us is the way we go. This is the most important thing we have as a company. This is our biggest asset, and this is why we can do what we do. So it is a very big challenge to do that. We have had times when we all met in the same place. We spent a lot of time together. We're talking together all the time. We are a team which is very caring and very aware of the other people, and so that means that we talk every day. So every day we have a call with the team where we talk about things that are work related. Obviously, we try to be efficient, but we always leave time to discussing things that are not work related. We share with each other's things about our lives. If something happens in Korea which is fun, or I just share with them. We send photos to each other. It's very specific, and it's difficult to answer the question because I think culture is very unique to each startup, and the only way it works is if you have your own culture and if you own it. And so for us, it's been a process where we have spent time together in different places. We have gathered. Everybody's traveled. We've been to Europe. We've been to Asia. Most people have met, and so we know each other very well. There's a lot of talking. Basically, the key is communication and making sure that you talk about everything. So when you work remotely, one of the big challenges that you have is that you cannot see people, which means that sometimes when you're on the phone, it's very difficult for you to do what you usually do as a human being, which is try to read through body language, how people look like, are they tired, are they a bit depressed today, anything. So the way we go about this is we make sure that we always care about each other when we talk. It's like, okay, how are you? And we mean this question. We want to know how people are, and we really listen and we ask questions, and we make sure that there is trust between us, which is so strong that we feel comfortable saying everything we need to say. And we know that people will take nothing personally, and they will just, we share a lot and we communicate. So that was a very long answer to a very short question, but that's because I think culture is really the most important thing you have in a company, at least of our size. And if I were to summarize my answer, I'd say communication is the key. You have to over communicate when you're not in the same place.
That's so true. And I would just, if I can jump on that with remote teams. Remote teams are a bit like online communities, which Seoul Startups is. And the important thing is kind of building the community culture around them, building community rituals around that remote team, around that online culture, and things that we kind of all agree to and aspire to. And like you said, over communicating is the only way around the whole hurdles that it brings along. We have been talking for some time, but I would love to wrap up with just one question for all of you, which is, what 3 tips can you give to a startup or a tech founder member now in these times? What are the 3 biggest tips on how to hack COVID-19 as a startup, as a FinTech company, as an accelerator? How about we start from you, Klaus?
Okay, I don't know if I can get to 3, but I'll just start maybe with 1 and also make a long answer. So basically, when you look back to history, right? So people like Churchill, they said this is not the end, it's not the beginning, it's perhaps the end of the beginning. So you have these cryptic messages, right? But for me, I think what we see is there's a new normal emerging, right? So I totally agree with Norbert also that I think the life 2021, I think will be different, and we are not through this crisis, and you know how countries react is very differently. When can we travel again? So now there's a travel corridor happening between Singapore and China, but I can't travel to Germany. And I asked the ambassador, and nobody knows when I can again, and all of it, right? So life is still complicated. It will stay complicated for quite some time. But nonetheless, I think we can see there's a new normal emerging somehow. So there is, out of this fog, there comes a picture. And I believe life will not go back to what it was before. It will be different. I don't think life will be worse. I think it will be different, right? And I believe we just have to be optimistic about the future and run around with open eyes and try to see what we see. And I think then things will happen. And before we talked about bailouts and creative destruction, I think that's a very interesting discussion. I also agree there with Norbert. I think using government or taxpayers' money may not be the right thing to do. My only point is, I mean, now they also use it for startups. In the past, they would use it for banks and many different, you know, organizations which may not have deserved it either. Now they pour it basically across the system, right? And I think it will help the system, but I also think companies will potentially disappear, startups will disappear, but new things will emerge, right? And I just think, you know, the future is interesting and we just need to be optimistic about it, and that will do the trick.
So stay positive. How about you, Norbert? What are 3 tips or words of wisdom you would like to share with the tech scene, the innovation scene here in Asia and beyond?
Well, what do they say? It's like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So hopefully it doesn't kill you. But I've done lots of interviews with startup founders, and right there is some commonality in them where people say that 9 out of 10 days are hard. It's like if you're looking to be happy, don't become an entrepreneur, right? The moments of happiness and the glory are very short, and the journey to get there is very, very long. So again, I think it brings us back to what I said earlier in terms of we had like a bull run that's been 10 years. I think we got used to exuberant markets and quite comfortable and accommodating conditions, also in terms of the funding, who got funded, what type of business models got funded. And this brings us back a bit more to reality. Now, if you, right, hopefully you raise your funds, you have enough runway, you can adjust a bit your cost base and stretch it out. But from a macro perspective, if you look at when the most successful startups have been created, it's typically the year off or shortly after a crisis. So if you want to end on this with positive note, then the full expectation is that the vintage year 2020, 2021 for startups will be an excellent one.
Well, just like good wine, eventually we'll look back upon these years fondly. Jordan, how about you? As a startup founder, what are 3 words of wisdom, or well, 3 phrases of wisdom you would like to share with your colleagues and your community?
I mean, I think that what has been said is very true. We are, as entrepreneurs, we're basically dealing with problems every day. So this comes at it's a big one, but it's our life to try and figure out solutions to problems. So I think all entrepreneurs will have that mindset. Now, we've actually written on what we think the world's going to look like after all that's happening, and then I'll be happy to share with everybody who wants to read that. I think that basically the key is what I said at the very beginning. I would say being aware of the environment as a startup entrepreneur is very important anyway. So it's a question of really trying to understand what's happening in the world and what that means for whatever we're doing. So it'd be silly right now to try to force what we're doing into what it was before the situation. It has to be something where the world is changing. People are having a different approach to life. And so whatever you were building is very likely to have to be reshaped to these new users or clients or consumers that you have. And so as an entrepreneur, you have to ask yourself the question, is what I'm doing coherent with the new world? And if I'm taking a hit, why and how can I actually change what I'm doing so that actually I can benefit from the new situation? Because as I said, there's so many companies who are actually striving through this crisis because they have the right business model at the right time. So it's a question of thinking about that as a startup, I think. And as usual, putting a lot of intensity and energy into trying to solve the problem.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. If there's no questions, and I don't see any questions from the audience right now, I would like to wrap up. Before we do so, I would like to give a shout out to Klaus and German Accelerator, who are having a webinar of their own just after this. There's a link in the chat if you're interested, and I've also posted it already on Seoul Startups Slack channel. So definitely check it out to hear more from Klaus and his colleagues. Another exciting thing. Thank you all three of you for joining us and sharing insights about different Asian markets, about different approaches, but also for kind of inspiring us with a little bit of hope for the future. I do personally look forward for us getting together and having that drink, whether it be in Seoul, in Tokyo, or Manila, right, Klaus? I think it was Manila. So hopefully we will get together very soon to do so. And so our participants are more than invited to join along the ride. So I wish you all a pleasant evening, and let's stay positive, and let's not give up on 2020. It's gonna be like Norbert said, it's gonna be a good vintage year eventually. So thank you again, everyone. Good night. Have a good night, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.